In this podcast, we're talking to Tim Marshall, Group Chairman of Get Mapping plc. He's a council member of Bucks New University. He's worked at senior levels in BBC outside broadcast events and entertainments, and in global TV production with Walt Disney, and as CEO with Janet, a research and education network.
If we get to the fraudulent end of the scale, I think it's absolutely true that civil society, whatever we mean by that, but I think we mean a society that works by consensus, by trust. If we get to a place where the end of the truth scale, where it's fraudulently facts are being represented, then society does break down. If you take in business, negotiation. Now, we all know that in most negotiations, the opening position is not the true position that you want to finish at. Now, everyone understands that's the game, you know the rules. Where it goes further up the grayscale is what happened in 2011, when a big American tech company bought a very progressive UK tech company for £8 billion, $11 billion. And subsequently, they found that they hadn't bought what they were thinking they'd bought. Now, the charge there, and I think there's still litigation, although someone has been found guilty of it, but the charge there was that it was fraudulent. So clearly that was a negotiation where it wasn't about we all knew the games. It was actually someone said something that allegedly, and it appears as was not true. Now that is clearly something that is a falsehood. But there are other areas in business where you know the game that each other is playing. And because you know that, I think it raises the question, if someone says something to you in a context in which you know that it's probably not the end position, are they telling an untruth? No, I don't think so, not in the same way.
And do you think that the value of truth is changing? You talked about the grey area. Is the grey area kind of expanding? Have you noticed that as you've gone through your career?
I think the grey area can be expanding for various reasons, possibly the way in which truth is disseminated. If you take truth at its purest, some have said it's a bit like a vegetable that your mother forced you to eat, highly nourishing, but deeply distasteful. The value of truth is probably something that lasts and never changes, but the way in which it's perceived does change. If you look at our newspapers, for example, if you buy a newspaper, you choose to buy it first of all, and you probably choose to buy it because it has a particular perception of the world that aligns with yours. Whether everyone that's reading it knows the position is a different question, but nevertheless, it is overtly taking a stance. So, but even then, interestingly, within a paper, you can then get different points of view. So if you take my interests, rugby, if you take the Times and the Sunday Times, you will get, I can think of 3 rugby correspondents. And if you think of them, they all have a different point of view of the same thing. So within a document, within an organ that's already got a perspective, you do get different perspectives. Now, if you try and say, what's truth? Well, I think the good thing about that is to the, quote, intelligent reader, there's the opportunity to take all those bits and put them together for yourself and make your own judgment on it.
And the newspapers, we know the background from which they're coming. We know what background the rugby correspondent's coming from or what political angle. But in social media, which is a source for news for many people, we don't necessarily know the background and the slant and the stance. Do you think that's a particular problem and issue?
I think it's a major problem. And I don't think it's just that you don't know where it's coming from. Even if you do know where it's coming from, you don't know how it's generated, how it's put together, what the judgment is. I was recently on a webinar where some established BBC journalists were discussing that, and they weren't against it. I mean, they were saying this is where the world's going. But they were asking the question, and it wasn't because they were older and came from another world. They were genuinely asking the question that when they developed their skills in broadcasting and news gathering, there was always someone older to turn to who said, no, I wouldn't do that. Or how about trying this? there was that sort of mentoring going on. It's being passed down, a bit like some of the biblical narrative, the way in which that was passed down as a story. And in the same way, it appears that who is developing those skills? It sounds an awfully paternalistic thing to say, but I think it's a fair question to say, who is developing the skills of some of the new players who disseminate news? Because the reason we're here is we're talking about truth, which we believe is incredibly important if we're going to have a society that functions and that has some sort of common understanding of the world, even if it's not common agreement.
And how, Tim, are you personally involved in countering disinformation and promoting truth? What do you see your role as being?
Well, that's a difficult question, an individual changing the world. Let me come to one thing that throughout my career has been important, and that is values. Trust and truth are quite close relations. And in business, I suppose I was inspired by Jack Welch, who put values into General Electric, and he'd go around asking people in the elevator, what's the third value? And if they didn't know, they got fired. I don't think it was quite that bad. But many people sort of latched onto this as a way in which they could, if you like, live in a much more truthful organization. But if we all realize that, which is part of humility, that none of us are perfect, that actually we can always look to others, and together we can do things that are much better. I think that's a truthful approach to life that actually leads to an environment where truth is practiced.
And if it's about changing society, then my last question for you, Tim, is this. What can those of us who are listening to you, watching this video, what can we do? What part can we play?
I think a constant understanding among all of us about what's really happening with the information that we get. And for example, I've got very intelligent friends, so I look at their tweets and I think they've lost their head sometimes, because whether it's some sort of cathartic experience that they can just get something off their chest, but these are intelligent, bright people who do say quite irrational and personal things on tweeting. I think far less of that would be good if we can all calm down a bit and try and address the issues, not the people. None of us are perfect. We can all get better. So why don't we all get better together? And I think that's one thing we can do, is try and develop a spirit of collaboration, of honesty, where we can disagree, but we make it disagreeing on the issues, not on the people.
There are 5 basic questions about truth in these podcasts. We're asking them of a wide variety of people to keep the conversation going.